We're talking about recent escalations in the Middle East. On Thursday, Israeli forces struck Yemen, attacking the capital and key infrastructure in the capital, including the airport and several power stations, in an effort to fight the Houthis. Several people have already been killed that have been reported. We'll talk about why this is happening and what this means for the broader region. Meanwhile, Israeli forces are pushing deeper into Lebanon despite the 60-day ceasefire agreement. Why is this happening? We'll find out. As well, who is al-Jilani, the insurgent leader that toppled Assad's government in Syria? Syria is home to several Russian military assets, and the Russians are now withdrawing several of these assets and moving some of it into Libya. Will this cripple the Russians? Will this hurt them more? And what does this mean for not just peace in the region, but for the war in Ukraine? We'll talk about whether or not this affects Trump's ambitions to bring peace to Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Discussing these themes with us today is Trita Parsi. He is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute and currently teaches at Georgetown University. He is also the co-founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. And an overarching theme of our discussion today will be the tension between Israel and Iran. Ultimately, will we see a war on the horizon before the inauguration? Trita says that escalations before the inauguration are very much possible. Let's find out what he has to say. Trita, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Lots going on over the holidays in the Middle East. Let's start by talking about recent news. According to officials, this is dated 14 hours ago, 3 people were killed at the airport, 30 injured, and it's said that 3 more people were killed and 10 wounded in the western province of Yemen. So the bigger question is, why are they attacking the Houthis now in Yemen, and why have they chosen to struck? I'm talking about the Israeli forces. Why have they chosen to struck public infrastructure versus just taking out key leadership like they did with the leader of Hamas?
So I think that's a very important question. Why precisely they're going after civilian infrastructure rather than military targets? I think obviously a background to this is that after the October 7th attacks, the Houthi movement in Yemen started attacking ships in the Red Sea, particularly those heading towards Israel, as a way of pressuring the Israelis to stop their onslaught in Gaza. The Houthi demand has consistently been that they will stop attacking ships in the Red Sea as well as attacking Israel itself once Israel stops the slaughter in Gaza. And during the 6-day ceasefire that actually occurred in November of 2023, the Houthis entirely stopped their attacks. So we have some precedence that shows that when there was a ceasefire and the Israelis stopped attacking Gaza, the Houthis also stopped attacking ships or Israel itself. Now, the Houthis have ballistic missiles that have been able to reach Israel. Several of them have penetrated Israeli air defenses. And the Israelis are, in their view, of course, retaliating against those. The difference is, and that's what your question put its finger on, why are they targeting so much of the civilian infrastructure, including, as you mentioned, the airport in Sana'a? And incidentally, the head of the WHO, the World Health Organization, was at the airport because he had been in Yemen negotiating the release of some UN personnel that had been kidnapped. He was at the airport when these attacks against the airport occurred. One person on his flight actually got injured, but thankfully, the rest of the crew was okay, although several civilians were killed at the airport. And it raises the question, why are they not going after military targets? And I think part of the reason is that unlike Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, the Israelis simply do not have intelligence on where the Houthi leaders are, etc. And as a result, do not have the same capacity of being able to target them. But even in these other cases, we have seen that over the course of the last year, the Israelis have given up any pretense of trying to minimize civilian casualties. They have no sense of proportionality when it comes to collateral damage. There was a study done by Ear Wars that just came out a week ago that showed that the civilian casualty rate in Israel's onslaught in Gaza is simply unprecedented. There's nothing like it in any recent air war. And the idea that, they're actually behaving better than the US did is just simply not borne out by the facts. And so targeting in this very large and indiscriminate way is frankly the pattern that has occurred. And as long as there's no international pressure or cost for Israelis to conduct itself this way, the Israelis are simply not likely to stop. I think it's also important to keep one thing in mind. If we connect what's happening in Syria to what is happening in Yemen,
yes.
you have in Syria.
We'll
Sorry,
talk about Syria in just a minute. And to your point about, sorry to interrupt you, but to your point about the Israelis attacking civilian infrastructure, a statement by the IDF, just to read the Israeli side, said its fighter jets conducted intelligence-based strikes on military targets belonging to the Houthi terrorist regime on the western coast and inland Yemen. They were also referring to military infrastructure at the Sana'a airport, as well as other power stations in the country. What's your comment on this?
Power stations are not, by any stretch of the imagination, military targets, nor bridges and things of that nature. We have, unfortunately, in war, truth is the first victim, and we have seen over the course of the last year and a half that the Israelis have increasingly targeted civilian infrastructure almost everywhere that they have bombed, because there simply is no pushback. And then they justify it by using language of this kind. But if I could go back to the Air Wars report, they show that, for instance, this argument that the Israelis are using, that the reason why there are a lot of civilian casualties is because Hamas is hiding among civilians. Based on the data that they saw that actually in 580 out of 606 cases that they studied in the first 3 weeks of the war, there was no overlap in any of those attacks between civilian and military targets, meaning there was not a single militant that was killed in 580 out of 606 attacks that the Israelis conducted in the first 3 weeks of that war. And even in the 26 cases in which there was militants killed, it was something around 30 militants killed for over 500 civilians. So it's completely disproportionate, loop-sided. And to believe that that is because the Israelis are really trying hard is just not borne out of the facts, because we don't have numbers of this kind in any other war. So, the justifications they will put out there, it will be repeated in the media. The facts on the ground speak a completely different truth, however.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made a comment on X. He says, I regret the recent escalation between Yemen and Israel and remain deeply concerned about the risk of further escalation in the region. Are you concerned about further escalation from the region, either because of what's happening right now in Yemen or other countries?
I'm terrified about the escalation risk in the region right now. The region is on the brink of a complete explosion. We're seeing what's happening in Syria. Of course, we do not know whether there will be a unified, stable government there, or whether the Turks will go in and root out what they call Kurdish terrorists. The US is actually supporting those Kurds. Will that bring about some form of a confrontation? The Turks are completely supporting the new government in Damascus that is, an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda. I mean, these people who are leading it were leading Al-Qaeda members for years. And they're now bumping up against Israel in the south as well. The Israelis are taking additional Syrian territory. And on top of that, you have the significant risk that the Israelis may actually also expand the war directly into Iran before Trump comes in. I think every day that passes and we get closer to inauguration date, the likelihood of such an attack by the Israelis probably decreases, because I think the Israelis recognize that Trump most likely does not want to see such an explosion in the region right at a time when he's taking office, and certainly does not want to get dragged into any such war. But because there has been essentially zero pressure from the Biden administration for the Israelis to show any semblance of restraint, the Israelis, particularly this right-wing government in Israel right now, is quite tempted and has a pathway towards escalating the war even further. And from their standpoint, the war at this point has been very successful. Hezbollah is much weakened. Hamas is more or less incapable of reconfiguring itself, at least not in Gaza. You have major conflicts between Hamas as well as the Palestinian authorities in the West Bank. Iran has been weakened, particularly after the loss of Syria. So the Israelis see a pathway towards a total military victory. But one has to keep in mind that the confrontation between Iran and Israel is going to be dramatically different from any confrontation the Israelis have, for instance, with the Houthis. So it's an extremely dire situation in the region right now.
Well, let's talk about Iran and Israel before we move on to Syria. As you know, the former president Ibrahim Raisi was killed in a helicopter crash a couple months ago in September. What do we know about the new president, Masoud Pezeshkian? What's his attitude towards not just the Israelis or Hezbollah? Is he going to be as supportive of Hezbollah as a previous regime and administration?
So I think one thing to keep in mind when it comes to the Iranian system is that there isn't really that significant variation when it comes to their perspective on Hezbollah. Hezbollah and Iran are probably the strongest alliance that has existed in the Middle East for the last 40 years. I don't believe that Hezbollah is a proxy, but Hezbollah and Iran are extremely tightly wedded together. Family ties, ideological ties, military ties, economic ties. So, the idea of the Iranians abandoning Hezbollah is probably as likely as the idea of the United States turning Israel into an enemy. There may be some variation of how much to support Israel, but the idea of turning Israel to an enemy is just simply not existent on the political spectrum in Washington. That's the same thing when it comes to Iran and Hezbollah. It's very different when it comes to Iran and Hamas, and certainly when it comes to Iran and the Houthis. The relationship with the Houthis is a relatively new one. The Houthis are very, very independent. They've certainly benefited from support from Iran, but the idea that the Iranians control the Houthis is simply not a reality, including Hamas. Hamas had its ups and downs with the Iranians. Incidentally, the founder of Hamas was deeply anti-Iranian, Sheikh Yassin, and he resisted any movement between Hamas and Iran towards warmer relations. Paradoxically, the relationship between Iran and Hamas only grew better as a result of the Israelis assassinating Yassin in 2004. And the next generation of leaders that came in were more open to the idea of getting closer to Iran, which they did. But then they had another fallout because Iran supported Assad in the Syrian civil war and Hamas was opposed to it. But when it comes to Ebrahim Raisi, I think this is a president who recognizes Iran needs to break out of its economic isolation. And as a result, it needs to drop some of the preconditions it had when it came to relations or negotiations with the US. So he ran on the platform of saying that he wants to negotiate with the US, and he didn't distinguish between Biden, Harris, or Trump. So he signaled openness to talking to Trump as well. Whereas during the previous 4 years that Trump was in power, the Iranians refused to directly engage with Trump until Trump would go back into the JCPOA, which of course he did not. He abandoned it entirely. Now, the Iranians are in a relatively weaker negotiating position, though, because they've lost much of Hezbollah. They lost Assad, of course, in Syria. And their exchange of fire between Israel and themselves, they've borne a lot of cost. They've inflicted a lot of damage on Israel as well. But clearly, this does not appear to be a war that the Iranians could win. And this is part of the reason why they've constantly tried to de-escalate for the last year. The question is, what will Trump do? Does Trump want to have a deal with Iran, even in Iran that is weaker? Is a weaker Iran a more attractive potential deal partner for Trump? Or is it the opposite? Will he feel that Iran has become so weakened that he actually starts favoring a military confrontation or some other forms of pressure in order to see the regime collapse altogether, which, many people in Washington for a long time have thought is possible, but so far we've seen that the regime has been tremendously resilient.
The issue of why the IDF is in Lebanon in the first place, I've heard or read remarks by Benjamin Netanyahu that their ultimate objective is still to stop Iran from obtaining nukes. This is part of their justification for attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, that aside, can we just comment on the nuclear program in Iran? Do we know for sure if Iran has currently or is on the verge of obtaining nukes, and what Israel's response is to this development?
So we do have pretty decent intelligence, thanks to the fact that the Iranians have allowed inspections, and because during the years that the JCPOA was fully implemented, that's the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. When it was fully implemented, the IAEA had complete insight into the Iranian nuclear program. As a result of that, we have actually pretty decent information on what they have and what they don't have. They don't have a military program. They do have enrichment. They have enrichment all the way up to 60%. You need 90% enriched uranium to be able to build nuclear weapons. But they have a decent amount of 60% enriched uranium, which means that they are probably no more than 7 days away from having the material for a bomb. That's very different from having a bomb because you have to test it. You also have to put it on a missile and make sure that you actually can deliver it. All of those things will probably take a year or two. But having the material for the bomb, the program is so advanced, much thanks to Trump leaving the JCPOA, that they can have the material within 7 or so days. If the JCPOA had not been abandoned by Trump, the Iranians would at all times be at least a year away from having the material for a bomb because of all of the restrictions that deal imposed on Iran. The Iranians agreed to those restrictions, but then abandoned them because Trump abandoned the nuclear deal, and the Europeans proved to be completely incapable of charting their own policy and continuing trade with Iran. They abided by the US sanctions, and as a result, the JCPOA is essentially dead. What's really dangerous now is that as a result of the developments of the last couple of years, and it's not just that the Iranians had losses through Hezbollah or Assad, but it's also because of the fact that they have seen, the entire world has seen, that the United States is unwilling to actually impose any restraints on Israel. And we've seen, the massive killings in Gaza. We've seen what they've done in Lebanon. We see what they have done in Syria. After the collapse of the Syrian dictator Assad, what happened? The Israelis started bombing the hell out of everything militarily that Syria has in order to make sure that any future regime in Syria, including a totally democratic one, would simply not have the capability of defending itself or posing any type of a challenge to Israel. All of this has shifted the debate in Iran, in which the voices who favor militarizing the nuclear program have become much, much stronger. And that's extremely worrisome because what was underappreciated in the West is that the actual consensus or the majority view in Iran over the course of all of these years actually was not in favor of building a bomb. It was in favor of using the nuclear program as a bargaining chip to secure some form of a deal with the West. Now we're starting to see, as a result of the changes in the region, the conduct of Israel and the United States, that the Iranian debate is shifting in favor of a military program.
So when you say that escalations could evolve between Iran and Israel before the January 20th inauguration of Donald Trump, what does that look like? I mean, presumably Israel may want to wait for Trump to make a new deal with Iran, a new nuclear deal. That's probably one option. The other option is what exactly, Trita?
Well, the Israelis don't want to see any deal between the United States and Iran. They've opposed every effort to have any form of a deal. And it's not about the details of the deal. It's about the deal itself. The very idea that tensions between the United States and Iran would reduce. From the Israeli standpoint, they believe that even if US-Iran tensions reduce, Israeli-Iranian tensions will not reduce. And as a result, this kicks in the Israeli fear of abandonment. The United States, having resolved at least most of its tensions with Iran, will essentially look elsewhere, particularly towards Asia, and increasingly be disinterested in the Middle East, while Israel is still stuck in the Middle East and from their view continues to face a hostile Iran. So they have, for the last 4 decades, made everything to make sure that there's actually a confrontation between Iran and the United States rather than any form of a deal. If the nuclear program actually was the core concern of the Israelis, then they would have actually favored the JCPOA because it really blocked off all paths for the Iranians to get a nuclear weapon. But they were very worried that the lifting of sanctions would allow Iran to once again be able to actualize its potential, which is to be one of the most powerful states in the region because of a combination of factors. But they didn't want that because that would shift the balance of the region against their interests. So keeping the sanctions in place indefinitely was a core Israeli interest, and any deal would have to lift some of those sanctions, which is why they've been opposed to it. I think they will favor striking now before Trump comes in, but every day that passes, I think the likelihood goes down because I don't foresee the Trump administration being particularly favorable towards this. Not because they have any fuzzy feelings towards Iran, of course, but because the incoming Trump team It's not a cohesive view, but the balance inside of that team is more in favor of getting out of the Middle East, not wasting resources in the Middle East, and instead shifting their focus towards Asia and particularly towards China, of course. And any confrontation in the Middle East is likely to either suck in the United States or at a minimum require massive amount of American resources. Just keep in mind that over the course of the last year and a half, the United States has provided more than $25 billion of weapons to the Israelis. So it's not as if this has been cost-free in any way, shape, or form. And to put that in context, the annual military aid that the United States gives to Israel is about $3 billion or so. This is now in 1 year almost 10 times that amount. So it's not as if this is is not costing the US anything. And on top of that, of course, you have the money that goes to Ukraine, etc.
The concept of brokering some sort of deal between the Israelis and the Iranians, what would that look like if the US were to try?
I don't think the US is in a position to try because the US itself doesn't have that relationship with Iran. The first step would be to actually get the US and Iran to be able to have some sort of a functioning relationship. But if that were to happen, I do believe, and this goes to the core of your question, Daniel, I do believe that there is a possibility for some sort of a modus vivendi between the Iranians and the Israelis. It wouldn't be a peace. It would be a tense Cold War, but one that at least would take out a significant amount of the tensions that currently exist. Because both of them view the other as some form of an existential threat. The Israelis believe that the Iranians are out there to destroy Israel altogether. The Iranians believe that the Israelis are doing everything they can to either cause the collapse of the regime or cause a regime change while significantly weakening Iran, just as the Israelis are now weakening Syria to make sure that it cannot pose a challenge in the future. We need to get out of that very negative dynamic. It's not going to be easy in any way, shape, or form. But and it's getting worse. But I've been in track 2 meetings in which both Israeli and Iranian officials have been there. And it's interesting. There are certain pathways to be able to get there, but the circumstances for it right now are probably the worst that we've seen for the last 20 years.
So when you say that the Israelis could strike or make some sort of overture before the inauguration, what would that be? What options do they have?
So the Israelis struck Iran on October 26th and destroyed significant parts of certain facilities that the Iranians had. And the common narrative is that they completely destroyed Iran's air defenses. I'm not so certain that that is true. There's some intelligence that suggests that the Israelis actually did not go forward with their third and the fourth wave of attacks because they encountered an unknown air defense system. But almost all of the attacks that the Israelis did were actually from Iraqi airspace. They did not go into Iranian airspace. But if they were to use their full Air Force capabilities to go in, and now they have an easier time to fly over Syria than they did before, they would target a large number of the nuclear facilities as well as conventional military facilities. The challenge, of course, is that the Israelis most likely do not have the capacity to destroy Iran's most important nuclear facilities because they're so deep underground. And in previous instances, the Israelis were actually thinking of doing a combination of strikes as well as infiltrate the country through commandos to blow up certain things inside the nuclear program because they couldn't simply do it from air. Even the United States, it's not entirely clear whether it would be able to destroy some of the facilities that are so deep in the mountains in Iran. But nevertheless, this is again part of the reason why there's a concern on the Trump side, because if the Israelis try and fail, it will dramatically increase the pressure on the United States for it to step in and try to finish the job, rather than having a scenario in which the Iranians are attacked, but the nuclear program is not destroyed, which then gives them the pretext of being able to leave the non-proliferation treaty, kick out all inspectors, and then turn their nuclear program completely dark and most likely move towards a nuclear weapon at a very fast pace, although we don't know entirely how fast that would be.
The prospect of an all-out war between Israel and Iran, how likely is that at this point? Why hasn't it happened already?
I would say it's probably somewhere between 30%. Part of the reason why it hasn't happened yet is because for the Israelis to do this, even though the US may not actively participate in the offensive leg of it, the Israelis would nevertheless need America, as well as a few other countries' defensive systems to be in support of it. So, for instance, the United States spent about $2 billion in just one day when the Iranians struck Israel. I think it was back in whether that was in April or whether that was on the October 1st attack. But nevertheless, I think that was the April attack because the Americans used a lot of their air defense system. They moved a lot of batteries there to be able to shoot down Iranian drones, missiles, etc. On October 1st, the Iranians struck again, and they got through a very large number of missiles. And many of those penetrated, even the American systems. And that's why the Israelis asked for the US to move AWAC batteries to Israel in order to protect Israel. So absent massive amount of American support, Israel's air defenses are simply insufficient to defend against Iranian attacks. So there is a bit of a balance of terror there in the sense that the Israelis clearly have a greater capacity of striking Iran, and the Iranians do not have an air defense system that is anywhere near what the Israelis do. But even with that, Iran's new missiles are so effective that they can penetrate Israel's air defenses, and as a result, inflict significant damage on Israel itself. This is part of the reason why the Israelis ultimately want the United States to step in, not only to defend it, but also to actually conduct the attacks. And that is exactly where the Biden administration is, where the Trump administration is not. There's certainly a lot of Iran hawks in the Trump circle, but you have to keep in mind, for Republicans to be hawkish on Iran has been a domestic political football that has been all benefit, no cost. But once you actually get to a point of an actual war, then suddenly it does have cost. And I think that's where you weed out those who are just superficially Iran hawks and those who are more like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, who seem to live for nothing else but to get to war with Iran.
Okay.
And those, the latter category, do not appear to be in the inner circle of Trump this time around.
Okay, so not an immediate possibility just yet, but we'll watch for that. Let's shift gears now to talk about Syria and talk about recent developments that we do know. First of all, it's been reported that Russia is pulling some of its military assets out of Syria, moving it to Libya, or some of it to Libya. Who is this leader of the insurgency, Mohammed al-Julani? What does he want? Where is he from? His ties to al-Qaeda before that he's worked to try to alienate himself from. What is his ultimate objective here? What do we know so far?
So first, we have to be very honest. We don't know that much in terms of exactly what he wants. He's certainly putting forward an image that seems to try to really whitewash his past, because now he's appearing in suit and tie, whereas this guy is someone who was in al-Qaeda, one of the founders of al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria. He was sent to Syria, back to Syria after first gone to Iraq to fight with al-Qaeda and killing Americans there. Then he was sent to Syria by al-Baghdadi, the founder of ISIS. But then he broke with them. And as you know, there's many different splinter groups amongst these jihadists, but he has been a jihadi and part of al-Qaeda for essentially all of his adult life. Yeah. Now he, of course, puts forward a very different image. The newly appointed intelligence minister in Syria, in his government, of course, is also someone who has very, very deep ties into al-Qaeda. These are not al-Qaeda operatives. These were al-Qaeda leaders. These are people who helped found al-Qaeda cells in Syria and in Iraq. Now, of course, they're putting forward an image of being modern, of wanting to be tolerant, wanting to unite Syria. And there is a reality in which other countries, on the one hand, are probably quite happy to get rid of Assad, but on the other hand, very worried about exactly where this will go. This would be the first transition of someone actually having been a jihadi al-Qaeda terrorist suddenly becoming the head of a state. We have not seen this before. We have to keep in mind the Taliban were not part of al-Qaeda. The Taliban later on hosted al-Qaeda, but they were essentially a Pashto movement in Afghanistan, whereas these people are people who are actually universalists. These were not looking for a nationalist cause. These were trying to create a larger Muslim ummah throughout the Middle East, and who rejected nationalist Arab causes and went for this, jihadi approach instead. This would be the first time that they have actually transitioned towards being the heads of state and getting accepted so fast. Now, of course, part of the reason why they're getting accepted is because Turkey is deeply, deeply behind this group, and they have now very quickly managed to take over the country. But there's nervousness in throughout the region about what this actually means. And we do not know quite yet exactly what he wants. Is this just a show? The images he's putting forward where he's wearing a tie, meeting with female officials from different countries? Or is this truly a renewed man who's actually somehow late in his Al-Qaeda life come to see the light and is much more favorable of a tolerant society? It remains to be seen, but I think being cautious is the right approach. The challenge, of course, is that Syria is being strangulated by these American sanctions, the Caesar Act. And one of the challenges with American sanctions, particularly those imposed by Congress, is that they're extremely difficult to lift. If it turns out that there actually is a genuine effort in Syria to move the country towards a much more liberal direction, much more tolerant direction, that can be sabotaged if these sanctions continue to remain in place. Lifting the sanctions can also be a very dangerous thing if it turns out that this actually is just a wolf in sheep's clothing, and that there really has not been any abandonment of the Al-Qaeda principles and the sectarian dimensions of their movement. In fact, if you take a look at much of what he has said, they've been quite forgiving of Russia, despite the fact that Russia played the most important role in saving Assad. And they have essentially saved all of their anger towards Iran, which also played a critical role in saving Assad, but less so than Russia in many different ways. And I think the only way to really explain why they're so forgiving of the Russians and so focused on Iran is precisely because this is Al-Qaeda, and they are deeply, deeply sectarian. And they have far more animus towards Shias, such as the Shias in Iran, than they have against Russians or others who actually supported Assad. So I think, again, it remains to be seen. It's a very tricky situation.
Are you surprised at the speed at which Assad's regime was toppled? I mean, the Assad family has been in Syria for, correct me if I'm wrong, 5 decades, I think. And all of a sudden, insurgencies just took over Damascus. What was your reaction to the speed and efficiency at which this happened?
I think everyone was taken by surprise, including the rebels themselves. I don't think actually they expected to win at all. I think they expected to perhaps take Aleppo and end up dealing a major blow to Assad, and then there would be some form of a negotiation. That seems to at least have been Turkey's intent behind the support for this group. So I think everyone was deeply, deeply surprised by this. Of course, it was quite known that Assad's regime was a deeply rotten regime, and that it didn't have deep support in the populace in any way, shape, or form. It's been one of the most brutal dictatorships in the region. Still, it was surprising to see how fast the whole thing just collapsed.
But why didn't Assad ask Russian military assets for help in the region?
It appears that there was both a request for help and an offer of help, but the reason why help couldn't be provided was because the assessment became quite clear rather soon that the Syrian army itself was not going to fight. And without the Syrian army being willing to fight, there was nothing the external parties could do, particularly given both of them, Iran on the one hand, Russia on the other hand, and of course Hezbollah on the third hand, all having been weakened. Russia being tied up in Ukraine, Iran seeing much of its system of partners weaken, and then of course Hezbollah being profoundly weakened with the assassinations of much of its leadership. So there wasn't the capacity, but also when the Syrian army itself didn't fight back, there was nothing that really could be done. In some ways, it reminds us of what happened in Kabul. Once the US withdrew its support for the government in Kabul, it just completely collapsed. It didn't have the will to fight the Taliban, and the Taliban took over the country very, very quickly. It shows, again, the illusion of propping up a government, whether it's the US propping up a Kabul government or the Iranians and the Russians propping up a government in Damascus. If it doesn't have any real roots of its own, that investment is just a sunk cost that will really come back to haunt all of them, as it has haunted the US and as it will continue to haunt Iran and Syria, Iran and Russia.
How did the Assad regime become so weak that even the army was unwilling to fight the rebels?
It's a combination of factors. Of course, it had become just a criminal state. It was living off of all types of criminal economic ventures. The sanctions had made it very difficult for the country to bounce back, of course. It was a deeply corrupt and tyrannical system. And then eventually, the will to fight simply wasn't there. Now, of course, much of the Syrian population seems to be quite happy to get rid of Assad, and I think that's quite understandable. But there's also a significant portion of the population that is happy about getting rid of Assad, but is also worried about what does it mean to live in a country in which the rulers are not just former rebels or, you call them terrorists, whatever, but actually Al-Qaeda and ISIS operatives who had this deeply, deeply sectarian perspective and are now suddenly saying that they're tolerant of everyone. Which, again, if it turns out to be true, that would be one thing. But there's good reason for everyone to be somewhat skeptical at a minimum.
Do we know, or do we have any evidence that the insurgency led by Jilani was actually supported by the U.S. and or its allies?
Look, these situations are very, very complex, and clear-cut explanations may be difficult to get. In the absence of any clear evidence that the U.S. actually was involved, all we have is interesting timing, such as the fact that the attack happened the day after the Hezbollah-Israel ceasefire, and that we saw that rather quickly. The Biden administration sent a senior official, Barbara Leaf, there to meet with Jilani, despite the fact that Jilani, at least until that moment, had a $10 million bounty on his head from the United States because he was a leading figure of Al-Qaeda. Now, that could be a sign of tremendous pragmatism from the Biden administration, but given how opaque things are in the region, you're going to have a lot of conspiracy theories or other types of theories. I personally have not seen any clear evidence that that is the case. That doesn't change the fact, however, that inside the U.S. government itself, particularly if you take a look at the email that Jake Sullivan sent to Hillary Clinton that was revealed by the WikiLeaks, that he mentioned to her, this is about 10 years ago, that Al-Qaeda is on the U.S.'s side in Syria because the U.S. was fighting Assad and so was Al-Qaeda. That does not, however, mean that 10 years or so later, the U.S. was in direct support of this takeover. But it certainly wasn't lifting a finger to support Assad in any way, shape, or form, or not, or trying to stop this assault by these rebels at the time, even though at the time they were still seen as Al-Qaeda and still had a $10 million bounty on the head of its leader.
I'd like to now understand, just closing off in Syria, the broader implications of the fall of Assad and on not just the Middle East, but also on Russia and Ukraine. This is an article from the Kiev Independent, but other sources may write similar things. But the collapse of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria following a lightning rebel offensive in November has had one other lesser-known consequence, disrupting Moscow's ability to recruit Syria's fighters for its war in Ukraine. Do we know how consequential this may be for the war machine of Russia? And ultimately, can this disrupt their goals in Ukraine?
I doubt it. Now, without a doubt, this is a loss for the Syrians and certainly for the Russians and certainly for the Iranians. But the direct link between this and Ukraine, I think, is a bit of a stretch. One can on the one hand say Russia has been weakened by this, but the idea that dramatically changes reality.
So just pause 1 second. How has it been weakened? We know that their military assets have been moved, but they haven't suffered direct damage to their military assets that I know of. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that's fair, but it also showed that the Russians had become weakened to the point in which they could not save Assad.
I understand.
And they may lose the port that they have in the Mediterranean on Syrian territory, which is very important for Russia not for Ukraine, but for their operations in Africa. And again, if that causes a loss there, again, it does weaken Russia. But here's the difference. Ukraine is in the near territory of Russia, meaning that it's in its immediate neighborhood, it's an immediate border area. It is far more important to the Russians than Syria is, despite the fact that Syria, of course, has been a long time ally, if not client state of Russia. So the idea that this would profoundly change it, as if the Russians don't have resources. I mean, part of the reason why they didn't have as much Air Force airplanes, fighter jets in Russia, in Syria, was precisely because they had moved everything back to Russia because they needed it in their own war. So I think it's a little bit of a wishful thinking to say that because Russia has suffered this setback in Syria, now that suddenly it means that it will also suffer a setback in Ukraine. I think there's an attempt here because there's a degree of desperation in the West.
Yes.
Particularly with Trump coming in, he's singing a very different tune on Ukraine.
Yeah.
Polls that just published today show that support for supporting Ukraine, whatever it takes, has collapsed in almost every European state, and favoring of some form of a deal, including if it means a shift of territory, is sharply on the rise in almost every European country as well. Given these circumstances, I don't find it surprising that people want to take any setback for Russia and try to make it bigger and make it sound as if this gives a reason to believe that things can turn around in Ukraine. Realities on the ground in Ukraine doesn't seem to suggest that at all.
Yeah.
And it's a different topic than what you were always supposed to talk about, but I think ultimately we're definitely reaching a point that some form of a negotiated deal, if possible, is to the interest of both the Ukrainians and the Russians, because people are dying completely needlessly without any prospect for either side of having a total military victory. And that's the moment you actually have to really show the courage of shifting towards negotiations.
So the recent developments, specifically the change of regime in Syria, does that make it easier for Trump to obtain peace immediately after inauguration?
Again, I don't think it translates as easily to that. You can definitely see an argument in which the Russians, because of a defeat in Syria, may be actually doubling down on a hard line in Ukraine. Bottom line is that Trump felt that Ukraine was very simple when he was far away from the problem. Now, when he's closer, I think he's realized that his promise of ending the war in 24 hours is not going to be particularly easy. Now, of course, with dramatically reduced support from Europe and the United States to Ukraine, it changes the balance even further against Ukraine, and the ability to continue the war is going to be very difficult. That does not mean, however, that a negotiation will be easy or that whatever they reach will be durable.
Yeah.
To truly be able to achieve a peace, you need to have a durable agreement that really benefits both sides, so that both sides have good reasons to want to stick to it rather than constantly looking for ways to cheat. And that's going to be very challenging. But I have to say, it's much better to pursue that diplomatic path rather than just blindly continue this war, particularly when you're seeing that the Ukrainians are suffering so much. They don't have the manpower and their ability to be able to recruit more soldiers is reaching a point in which they're recruiting people that are 45 or just simply not fit to fight in a war.
Finally, before we go, Trita, I want to just bring your attention to something I alluded to earlier in the interview, but we haven't touched on in detail yet. The Israelis, going back to Israel and Lebanon, Israelis are pushing deeper into southern Lebanon, despite what people are calling a violation of the ceasefire agreement. They have a 60-day ceasefire. Instead of withdrawing south towards the border, they're pushing more inland. What is going on here? Do we know?
As I mentioned earlier on, the Israelis are sensing that they're having a military momentum combined with zero pushback from the West. Of course, the rest of the international community is very much up in arms, but there's a limit to what they can do. But as long as the Israelis get away with whatever they're doing, there's no incentive for them to abide by an agreement that they signed, to not take more territory. And we haven't talked about the fact that they're annexing additional territory in Syria as well. So the Israeli government now sees an opportunity to really expand not only territory, but also what they call their strategic depth by creating additional buffer zones And those buffer zones in the past have turned into annexation. So, for instance, they're talking about a buffer zone to protect the Golan Heights.
Yeah.
Well, the Golan Heights was a buffer zone because it's not Israeli territory, it's occupied Israeli territory, it's Syrian territory that the Israelis occupy. And now they want a buffer zone to protect that buffer zone. That's exactly what you call an expansionist state.
Can we see?
And it's going to continue to do so until there's pushback.
Can we see an elongation of the war in Lebanon then, now that this supposed ceasefire is not being respected?
Yes, because this is only a 60-day ceasefire, and it was, very few people expected that it would be able to last. The deal itself was, to a very large extent, a bit of a capitulation from Hezbollah's side. And the expectation, frankly, was that this would restart. The fact that the timing of this is more or less coinciding with the inauguration of Trump is not a coincidence.
Okay. Trita, this has been a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. Where can we learn more from you and study your work?
You can go to my personal website, which is www.tritaparsi.com. And you can go to the Quincy Institute's website, which is quincyinst.org.
Okay, we'll put those links down below, so make sure to follow Trita there. Appreciate it. Very good talk.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on the show and educating us. Happy New Year to you, and we'll speak again.
Happy New Year to you too as well.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.